Shadow Minister Stephen Kinnock.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to actually start by thanking the noble lords in the other place for all the hard work they've done in trying to amend this bill, which we know is quite frankly a sham and a con. But I'd like to highlight the restraint that they've exercised, actually, because despite the deeply damaging nature of this legislation in terms of its impact on our constitutional conventions and our adherence as a country to the rule of law, none of the amendments that are before us today are seeking to wreck the bill or the unworkable, unaffordable and unlawful scheme that the bill is seeking to enact. Not one of them would prevent flights to Rwanda taking off. Not one of them would stop the government flogging this dead horse of a policy. Instead, they seek only to commit the government to the promises it has already made about who will be sent to Rwanda and to clarify the mechanisms that will underpin that process. Now, I note that ministers have claimed that there is tremendous and pressing urgency in all of this. But if that is the case, then why did the government forego the opportunity to use Monday the 25th and Tuesday the 26th of March for debates and divisions on this bill? Could it be because they needed extra time to scramble high and low for an airline that wanted to be associated with this unworkable, unaffordable and unlawful scheme? Or could it be because the Home Secretary is unable to decide who should be exempted from deportation to Rwanda? Indeed, it has been reported that the entire harebrained scheme has been given a red risk rating in the Home Office because of his dithering. Which brings me to the Permanent Secretary's comments at the Public Accounts Committee on Monday, namely that 40,000 asylum seekers are currently stuck in the truly Kafkaesque perma-backlog of inadmissible cases whose claims for asylum the government are refusing to process. 40,000 is an awful lot of flights required, Madam Deputy Speaker, given that the government hasn't actually managed to get one flight off the ground, and given what we know about the Rwandan government's capacity to process just a few hundred cases per year. So given that a maximum of around 1% of the asylum seekers who are in the perma backlog can be sent to Rwanda, what is the Minister's plan for the remaining 99% who are stuck in this indefinite limbo of his government's own making? Is the plan to keep them in taxpayer-funded hotels, maybe, of which hundreds are still in operation, according to what the other immigration minister said on Monday, despite the government's boasts? Or perhaps they'll have an amnesty, which the Conservative member for South Thanet warned about last year, and his colleague, the Honourable Member for East Shoreham and Worthing, warned about at that very committee. Well, we know what we would do, Madam Deputy Speaker. We would deliver our backlog clearance plan, surging the number of decision makers to process claims quickly, and set up our new returns and enforcement unit with 1,000 new staff to remove those who have no right to be here. It is quite frankly shocking that the number of foreign criminals being removed has dropped by a staggering 27% under the Conservatives, and also profoundly worrying that the number of failed asylum seekers being returned has plummeted by 44% in that time, with just 2% of small boat crossers removed since 2018. What a sorry state of affairs. Put our plan for a new returns unit together with our cross-border police unit to go after the criminal smuggler gangs operating in the channel upstream, funded, of course, through redirecting the money that's being squandered on Rwanda. And that gets you a compelling and realistic plan, Madam Deputy Speaker. A plan that is based on hard graft, common sense and effective international cooperation, in stark contrast with the headline-chasing gimmicks, empty gestures and blank cheques that have come to define the way in which successive Conservative governments have broken our asylum system and lost control of our borders. Madam Deputy Speaker, the government's refusal to engage constructively with the other place on this bill is deeply disappointing, given that their lordships have simply been fulfilling their constitutional duty to revise and improve the draft legislation that we convey to them. The noble Baroness Butler-Sloss received a tiny concession for her commendable attempts to stop the government sending victims of modern slavery to Rwanda. But let's be clear, that concession was barely worth the paper it was written on. And it is utterly shameful that ministers are still refusing to accept the amendment in the name of the noble Lord Brown. Madam Deputy Speaker, we owe a debt of honour and gratitude to the Afghans who so bravely fought alongside British troops. And the idea that we might send them to Rwanda is simply unconscionable. But the noble Lord Brown's amendment is not only driven by a moral imperative, it is also underpinned by our national interest and by military logic, for the simple and obvious reason that the ability of our armed forces to recruit local allies will be severely constrained if this bill passes unamended. Turning now to the other amendments that are before us today, it cannot be repeated often enough that adherence to the rule of law must remain at the heart of our constitutional conventions and as a cornerstone of our liberal democratic values. It is therefore profoundly concerning that ministers continue to refuse to recognise how important it is for Britain to abide by these principles and to have this commitment on the face of the bill. I will give it.
The member for Aberdeen, I just simply want to say to him, if I may, and to put it to him, that the rule of law includes the basis of sovereignty on which it is quite clear from one great jurist to another, right the way down through generations, that where an act of Parliament is clear and unambiguous in its wording, it is the duty of the courts, as my honourable friend the member for Mid Dorset said just now with regard to Lord Reed's judgment, paragraph 144, it's the duty of the court to give effect to those words. That is the rule of law, not this confection which the honourable gentleman is generally producing time and again. And if I may say so, he's flogging a dead horse, not just once, because he keeps on saying it. He's repeated himself now 3 times. I've never seen a dead horse flogged so badly as by the honourable gentleman.
Well, taking lectures about flogging dead horses in the context of a debate about Rwanda really is quite extraordinary. If you wanted a definition of a dead horse, that's what this policy is. But we have had many exchanges on this point, and I enjoy my exchanges with the honourable member on this point. As I repeatedly say to him, yes, Parliament is sovereign, but Parliament must act with due care and attention and caution with regard to the opinions that come from our most eminent court, the Supreme Court. And in this case, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that Rwanda is not a safe country. So it is frankly a travesty that Parliament is seeking to undermine the rule of our judiciary in that way, and it raises deeply troubling questions about this issue of the rule of law. I will give way.
Where would the proposed returns unit send illegals to, and what if the countries concerned didn't want to receive them?
I'm pleased the honourable gentleman asked me that question, because we get this point from the benches opposite about returns. But what I find fascinating is that when you look at countries like India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, which are clearly safe countries in principle, 80% of the applications from those countries whose asylum claims fail are not being removed by this government. For instance, the Home Office rejected asylum applications from 1,750 Pakistanis in 2023, yet Home Office data shows that just 620 people were removed to Pakistan in 2023, of which a fraction, a clear proportion of that would have been asylum seekers. Some may well have been foreign national offenders. So the key point here is that there are many, many countries where it is more than possible to be returning people to those countries, and the government is simply failing to do so. We also had an extraordinary question from my colleague, the member for Newport East, in Home Office Orals on Monday, where she talked about someone in her constituent who is a foreign national offender, who's been convicted of a sexual offence, and has asked to be voluntarily returned to his country of origin, and the Home Office has not facilitated and not been allowing to make that happen. So there is something going seriously wrong in terms of returns. 44% plummeted number in terms of failed asylum seekers since 2010. And I think we should be focusing absolutely on those countries with low grant rates, because that is where you can clear some of this backlog and return people to their country of origin when they have no right to be here. I will give way.
I thank the Shadow Minister for giving way. I find it very interesting, his suggestion that all we need to do is ask India for emergency travel documents and they will immediately issue them. Has he made any attempt to find out what the issues might be there?
The key point here is, as I've said, that under the last Labour government, returns were working. Now, a part of that, I would suspect, is based on proper adult grown-ups being in the room and having proper adult grown-up diplomatic conversations with the governments with which we mean to engage. And I think what we've seen over the last years with this government is a consistent commitment to burning diplomatic relationships with a whole range of countries. And when you burn those bridges, it makes it much more difficult to achieve what we need to achieve in terms of our own national interest. So what we are clear on is that we've seen the government promising from that dispatch box a whole range of things, and the Lord's amendments on these rule of law issues before us are simply seeking to put on the face of the bill what ministers have promised. Why else are they rejecting the amendment in the name of my noble friend, the Lord Coker, which simply asks the government to commit to promises that they have made? Likewise, why not support the Lord's amendment in the name of the noble Baroness Chakrabarti, which allows ministers, officials and courts to consider whether Rwanda is safe for individuals on a case-by-case basis if the government supports the principle of appeals as ministers claim that it does.
Would I be right in thinking that because the noble Lord Coker has brought this forward in one shape or another several times, and it is central to this debate, in the light of what I said a bit earlier in my intervention, is the Leader of the Opposition supporting that amendment, and if so, why?
Well, for the simple reason that we simply want to put on the face of the bill an articulation of what has already been said by ministers from the dispatch box, and we feel that it is extremely important to underline this country's commitment to the rule of law. And clearly, he mentions the Leader of the Opposition. As an eminent lawyer himself, there are few that are more committed to the rule of law than he. And finally, if there is a parallel universe in which the Rwandan government is able to process asylum claims in a safe and competent manner, then surely it makes sense to verify that point and those measures that are set out in the Rwanda Treaty, and to verify that they have been fully implemented, and for the government's hand-picked monitoring committee to establish that this is the case. That is not an unreasonable request from the noble Lord Hope, and the government should therefore be supporting his amendment, precisely as the chair of the Justice Select Committee pointed out. He's no longer in his place, but as he pointed out earlier. Madam Deputy Speaker, let me end by saying that the British people are looking on at this government's attempts to continue flogging this dead horse, which seems to have become the metaphor of the day, of a bill with a growing sense of bemusement and anger. Because blowing £500,000 of taxpayers' money on sending 300 people to Rwanda is utterly mind-boggling. And it is equally staggering that £2 million will be spent per asylum seeker to send them to Rwanda. Madam Deputy Speaker, you could surely spend £2 million more effectively on sending the Prime Minister and his 4 predecessors on a one-way trip to outer space with Virgin Galactic. Or, Madam Deputy Speaker, perhaps the right thing to do would be for the government to drop this entire failing fiasco and instead to adopt Labour's detailed plan to repurpose the Rwanda money into smashing criminal smuggler gangs and ending the Tory small boats chaos. We know what this bill is really about. The former immigration minister admitted it in December. It's all about the Prime Minister getting, and I quote, a few symbolic flights off the ground before the general election. And this weekend, a civil servant confirmed to the Eye's Lizzie Dearden in the Eye newspaper that efforts are geared towards a single flight as proof of concept, I quote, calling it an election vanity scam. And that really does tell us everything we need to know. None of this is actually about dealing with the chaos that they have created. They've just focused on getting a couple of symbolic flights off the ground. It's letting the cat well and truly out of the bag. Everyone can see this Rwanda scheme for what it really is. everyone can see this legislation for what it really is, and everybody can see this government for what it is. I think we need a new one, and so too do the British people. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.